"People like you don't sit here," the man said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the soft hum of jazz and clinking glass. And for a moment, everything in the room seemed to tilt toward that single sentence as Ethan Cole's hand paused midair above the white linen tablecloth, fingers still curled around the stem of a half-full wine glass, the deep red inside catching the chandelier light like something alive. The chair beneath him shifted slightly as it was pulled back, not violently, not abruptly, just enough to make it clear that someone else had already decided it didn't belong to him. And Ethan looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, meeting the gaze of Daniel Whitmore, who stood there in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his jaw set with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once been told no. While beside him, Sophie Whitmore rested a manicured hand lightly on the back of the chair, her diamond bracelet glinting as she tilted her head with a polite, almost practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Around them, the room stretched wide and elegant, a private rooftop venue overlooking the city skyline, where glass towers blinked in the distance like distant stars. Every table set with precision, every guest dressed in muted luxury, the kind that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. And yet the energy shifted now, subtle but undeniable, as conversations softened and a few heads turned, not enough to make a scene, just enough to notice. Ethan didn't move right away, his thumb brushing once against the cool glass in his hand before he gently set it down, the base making a soft, controlled tap against the table, and for a brief second, his eyes dropped to the small card placed neatly in front of him, his name printed in clean black letters, perfectly centered, perfectly intentional, before Sophie reached forward and, with a casual flick of her fingers, rotated it 90 degrees as if correcting a mistake, her voice light, almost amused as she said, "There must have been a mix-up." And Daniel gave a quiet chuckle, not loud, not cruel, just dismissive, like this was all routine, like this was how things worked, and Ethan inhaled slowly through his nose, the air cool against his lungs, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and citrus from the bar across the room. And still he didn't stand, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lifted his gaze again, steady now, grounded, as if the noise around him had faded into something distant and unimportant, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it, waiting to see whether he would disappear quietly or do something that didn't fit the script already written for him. While Daniel's hand tightened slightly on the back of the chair, his patience thinning just enough to show in the edge of his posture, and Sophie's smile sharpened, polite but firm, as if the decision had already been made long before Ethan ever sat down. And somewhere behind them, a server hesitated mid-step, tray balanced carefully, eyes flicking between the three of them, unsure whether to intervene or pretend not to see, because in rooms like this, the rules were rarely spoken out loud, but everyone understood them. Ethan's fingers rested flat against the table now, feeling the smooth fabric beneath his palm, grounding himself in something real as the low murmur of the crowd slowly returned, conversations resuming in careful fragments, though the tension lingered just beneath the surface like a held note in a song. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying just far enough to be heard by those closest without demanding attention, as if he were simply stating a fact rather than challenging a decision. And yet something in the way he said it, measured, certain, made it land heavier than expected, made it echo just a little longer in the air between them, in a space where power was usually decided before anyone ever opened their mouth. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, like something fragile being pulled too far, and Ethan's voice lingered in that space, calm and deliberate, as if it had been placed there with intention rather than reaction, his words simple, almost understated, but anchored in a certainty that did not ask for permission. And Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came when expectation met resistance, while Sophie let out a soft breath through her nose, her fingers still resting lightly on the chair as though she had not yet decided whether this moment was worth her attention or beneath it. Ethan remained seated, his posture relaxed but not careless, shoulders level, back straight, as though the chair beneath him was not something temporary but something chosen, something earned, and his gaze did not challenge them, did not plead. It simply held steady, unflinching, as if he had already decided that leaving was not an option. The ambient music drifted back into awareness, a slow instrumental piece that hummed beneath the surface. But it felt quieter now, distant, like it belonged to another room, because here, at this table, something unspoken had taken hold, something that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Daniel glanced briefly toward the surrounding tables, noticing the subtle attention, the way a few nearby guests had angled their bodies just enough to listen without appearing obvious. And that awareness seemed to irritate him more than the situation itself, because control, in spaces like this, was often about perception, about maintaining the illusion that everything unfolded exactly as intended. "Look," Daniel said, his tone measured but firmer now, lowering his voice as if that alone would re-establish order. "There is a seating arrangement for a reason," and he gestured lightly toward the card on the table, now turned out of alignment. "And I am sure whoever set this up made a mistake." While Sophie nodded faintly beside him, her smile returning, softer this time, more composed, as if smoothing over something inconvenient. "It happens all the time," she added, her voice almost reassuring, though her eyes remained sharp, observant, calculating. Ethan's gaze dropped once more to the card, his name still visible despite its angle, the ink dark against the cream surface, precise and intentional, and for a brief moment, his fingers moved toward it, not to defend it, not to reclaim it with urgency, but simply to straighten it, to return it to the position it had been placed in. Before, the motion slow, controlled, deliberate, and when he finished, he withdrew his hand just as calmly as he had moved it, as though the act itself required no explanation. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, yet it carried a quiet finality that did not go unnoticed, because it was not defiance in the loud sense, not the kind that raised voices or drew lines in the sand. It was something steadier, something rooted, deeper, and that unsettled Daniel more than any argument could have, because there was no easy way to dismiss it. Across the table, a woman in a charcoal dress paused mid-sentence, her glass hovering just below her lips as she watched, her expression neutral but attentive, while a man beside her adjusted his cufflink slowly, eyes flicking between Ethan and Daniel, the subtle audience growing without acknowledgement. Each person careful not to be seen as watching, yet unable to look away. Ethan finally lifted his eyes again, meeting Daniel's gaze not with confrontation but with clarity, and when he spoke, his voice remained even, almost quiet, yet it carried the kind of weight that did not depend on volume. "I checked the arrangement before I sat down," he said, each word placed carefully, without rush. "This is where I am supposed to be." And there was no emphasis, no edge, just truth, stated plainly, as though the outcome of this moment did not hinge on whether they agreed, only on whether they chose to see it. Sophie's fingers slipped from the chair back, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly, while Daniel's jaw tightened again, the tension now less about the seat itself, and more about something he could not quite name, something in the way Ethan remained exactly where he was, unmoved, composed, present, as if the room around him had begun to shift instead. Daniel let out a short breath that barely passed for a laugh, the kind that carried more impatience than humor, and he shifted his weight slightly, one hand sliding into his pocket as if grounding himself in a position he was used to holding, a position where things aligned quickly once he spoke, where hesitation did not linger this long in the air. "You checked," he repeated, his tone lighter now, but edged with something sharper beneath, as though testing the phrase for weakness, while Sophie's gaze moved again to the name card, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, studying it more closely this time instead of dismissing it outright, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of calculation that she quickly masked behind composure. The server who had paused earlier took a careful step forward, then stopped again, tray still balanced at shoulder height, the glasses on it trembling just slightly with the movement. Not enough to spill, just enough to catch the light, and scatter it across the table like fractured reflections, and the room, though still filled with conversation, carried a different rhythm now, a quieter undercurrent that circled this table without fully landing, as though everyone nearby could feel something shifting but had not yet decided what it was. Ethan remained still, his hands resting loosely against the table's edge, fingers relaxed, not gripping, not bracing, simply present. And there was a steadiness in the way he occupied the space. A kind of quiet certainty that did not need reinforcement, did not reach outward for approval, and that, more than anything, began to unsettle the balance Daniel was trying to maintain, because it removed the usual path forward, the one where pressure led to compliance. "Let me make this simple," Daniel said, lowering his voice further, leaning in just enough to create the illusion of privacy, though the effect was the opposite, drawing more attention rather than less. "We are not trying to cause a scene, but this seat is reserved." And he tapped the table lightly with 2 fingers, a small, controlled motion that carried the expectation of resolution, while Sophie added, softer but no less pointed, "There are other seats. I am sure we can find something more appropriate." The word appropriate hanging in the air longer than intended, its meaning clear without needing explanation. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly toward the rest of the table, taking in the subtle reactions, the averted gazes, the careful neutrality of people who preferred not to choose sides. And then he looked back at Daniel, his expression unchanged, calm but no longer distant, something more present behind it now, something attentive. He reached once more for his glass, lifting it just enough to clear the table, not to drink, just to move it aside, creating a small open space in front of him. And then he placed both hands flat against the linen again, palms resting evenly, as though anchoring himself in the moment rather than yielding to it. "I understand what you are saying," he replied, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. "But I am exactly where I need to be." And there was no challenge in the statement, no rise in tone, only a quiet finality that made it difficult to push against without escalating the situation further. Sophie's posture shifted again, more noticeably this time, her shoulders drawing back slightly, as she glanced toward the entrance of the venue, scanning the room as if looking for someone, anyone, who could confirm her version of reality, while Daniel's jaw tightened once more, the faintest sign that control was slipping, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that he could feel it, and in spaces like this, that feeling alone was enough to create discomfort. At the edge of the room, near the entrance where guests had been welcomed earlier, a figure in a dark suit began, moving toward the tables, not hurried, not hesitant, just purposeful, weaving through the crowd with a familiarity that suggested authority. And though most people had not yet noticed, Sophie's eyes caught the movement first, her gaze lingering for half a second longer than necessary, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by Ethan, who followed the line of her sight for just a moment before returning his attention to the table, his expression unchanged, as if whatever was approaching was not a surprise, not a disruption, but simply the next step in something already set in motion. The figure moved closer with an ease that did not ask for attention, yet somehow drew it anyway, weaving between tables with a quiet authority that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. And as he approached, a subtle shift passed through the nearby guests, conversation softening, shoulders angling just slightly to make space without being told. The kind of reaction that came not from recognition alone, but from instinct. Sophie's gaze stayed fixed in that direction. Now, her earlier composure tightening at the edges, while Daniel followed her line of sight a moment later, his posture adjusting almost imperceptibly as he straightened, the tension in his jaw easing into something more controlled, more performative, as if preparing to greet someone important rather than continue an argument that had not gone the way he expected. Ethan did not turn immediately, his attention still anchored to the table in front of him, fingers resting lightly against the linen, feeling the faint texture beneath his skin, grounding, steady, and only after a brief pause did he shift his gaze, not hurried, not reactive, simply acknowledging the presence that had entered his space, his eyes lifting just enough to meet the approaching figure without fully engaging, as though this moment had already been accounted for. The man in the dark suit slowed as he reached the table, his shoes making a soft, deliberate sound against the polished floor, and for a second, he did not speak, his eyes moving across the scene with quiet precision, taking in the angled name card, the untouched place setting, the subtle distance between Ethan and the couple standing beside him, reading the situation without needing explanation, and that silence, brief as it was, carried more weight than any immediate question could have. Daniel was the first to act, a polite smile settling onto his face as he extended a hand slightly, his tone shifting into something smoother, more practiced. "Good evening," he began, as though the previous tension had never existed, as though this was simply a moment of introduction rather than interruption. "I believe there has been a small mix-up with the seating." And he gestured lightly toward the chair. Careful now, measured, framing the situation as an inconvenience rather than a conflict, while Sophie added a soft nod beside him, her expression composed, her voice gentle. "We were just about to sort it out." As if the outcome had already been decided, the man's gaze lingered on Daniel for a moment, then shifted to Sophie, and finally settled on Ethan, and something in his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that did not need to be spoken. And for the first time since he arrived, a hint of warmth entered his eyes, though it remained controlled. Professional, contained. Ethan met that look calmly, offering a slight nod. Nothing more, no words exchanged. Yet the acknowledgement between them seemed to exist on a different level than everything that had just unfolded, something quieter, more certain, and that quiet exchange did not go unnoticed. Daniel's hand, still partially extended, hovered for a fraction longer than it should have before lowering again. The gesture incomplete, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, quickly, masked but not entirely erased, while Sophie's posture stiffened just enough to betray the shift she felt, her eyes moving between the two men as if trying to piece together something that had not been obvious moments ago. The man in the dark suit finally spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be raised to be heard. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, not directing the question at anyone in particular. Yet the weight of it settled clearly on Daniel and Sophie, the room around them growing quieter again, not silent, but attentive in a way that made every word matter more than it should have. And Ethan remained exactly where he was, seated, composed, his hands still resting against the table, as if nothing about his position had ever been uncertain to begin with, as if the question now was not whether he belonged, but whether the others had understood the room they had walked into. Daniel hesitated for just a fraction too long, and in a room built on confidence and quick responses, that pause did not go unnoticed, his eyes flicking briefly towards Sophie before returning to the man in the dark suit, searching for the right version of the truth to present, one that would preserve control without revealing the tension that had already unfolded. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that polished calm again, though it felt thinner now, stretched over something less stable. "No problem at all," he said, offering a small, controlled smile. "Just a minor confusion with the seating arrangement." And he gestured lightly toward the chair Ethan occupied, careful not to make the motion too sharp, too pointed, as if the situation could still be softened into something harmless. Sophie nodded beside him, her posture elegant but no longer effortless, her fingers now clasped loosely in front of her instead of resting with casual ownership. "We thought there might have been a misprint," she added gently, her tone almost apologetic, though her eyes remained alert, watching the man's reaction closely, measuring it. The man in the dark suit did not respond immediately, his gaze moving once more to the name card, now properly aligned in front of Ethan, then to the place setting, untouched except for the single glass that had been moved and returned, and finally back to Ethan himself. And in that brief silence, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself was waiting for a line to be drawn, for clarity to settle where assumption had been. Ethan remained still, his expression composed, not detached but present, his breathing steady, shoulders relaxed, and there was no urgency in him, no need to speak into the silence or fill it with explanation, because the weight of the moment was not something he needed to carry alone. It was already beginning to redistribute itself across the table. A faint sound echoed from somewhere behind them, the soft clink of a glass being set down just a little too firmly, followed by a quiet murmur that quickly faded, and though no one openly turned, the awareness of attention pressed closer, like a circle tightening without being seen. Daniel cleared his throat softly, a small, controlled sound, and shifted his stance again, one foot angling slightly as if preparing to step back, though he did not yet move. We were about to find him another seat. He continued, choosing his words carefully. Something more comfortable, and the addition of that last phrase lingered, not quite landing the way he intended, because comfort was no longer the question, and somewhere beneath the surface, he seemed to realize it. The man in the dark suit finally spoke, his tone even, unhurried, but carrying a clarity that cut through the layered politeness. "I see," he said, and his eyes remained on Ethan for a moment longer before shifting back to Daniel and Sophie. Not confrontational, not accusatory, simply certain, and that certainty created a quiet pressure that neither of them could easily redirect. Sophie's composure tightened further, her lips pressing together briefly before she forced a softer expression, her gaze dropping for a moment to the table before lifting again, as if recalibrating, while Daniel's hand flexed slightly. At his side, fingers curling and uncurling once in a restrained motion that betrayed more than he intended. Ethan's presence at the table felt different now, not because he had changed, but because the perception around him had begun to shift, the same stillness, the same quiet control, now carrying a weight that had not been acknowledged before, and as the seconds stretched, it became increasingly clear that the situation was no longer about moving a chair or correcting a name card. It was about something deeper, something that could not be undone with a polite suggestion or a subtle redirect, and in that realization, the room seemed to lean in just a little closer, waiting for the moment when assumption would finally give way to truth. The air seemed to settle into something heavier, thicker, as though every sound in the room had been wrapped in velvet, softened but not gone, and Ethan could feel it. Without looking, the way attention gathered in quiet spaces, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to press against the edges of a moment. His fingers shifted slightly against the table, not restless, just aware, tracing the faint seam in the linen where it folded beneath the plate, grounding himself in something small and tangible, while everything around him hovered in uncertainty. The man in the dark suit remained still, his posture composed, his gaze steady, not rushing to resolve what had already begun to reveal itself. And in that restraint, there was a kind of control that did not need to assert itself loudly, a patience that allowed the truth to surface on its own. Daniel's confidence, once effortless, now moved differently, his shoulders still squared but no longer relaxed, the set of his stance carrying a subtle tension, as if he were holding a position that no longer felt entirely secure. And Sophie's expression, though still composed, had softened at the edges. Her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, more cautious, her eyes flicking once more to the name card before settling briefly on Ethan, as though seeing him more clearly now, not just as someone in the wrong place, but as someone who had never been misplaced to begin with. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady and controlled, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that did not match the tension around him. Because whatever this moment had become, it was not new to him, not entirely unfamiliar, and there was a calm in that recognition, a stillness that came from having stood in similar spaces before, where perception lagged behind truth, where judgment arrived faster than understanding. Somewhere near the edge of the room, a glass was lifted, then set back down again without a sip, the small motion reflecting the hesitation that had spread, and even the music, still playing softly in the background, seemed to drift further away, as if the room itself had leaned inward, focusing on a single point without admitting it. The man in the dark suit shifted his weight slightly, just enough to break the stillness without disrupting it, his eyes moving once more across the table, and when they returned to Ethan, there was something unspoken there, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any introduction could have, and Ethan responded with the slightest nod, not deferential, not performative, simply present, as if confirming something that had already been understood. Daniel noticed that exchange, and though it lasted only a second, it lingered in his mind longer than it should have, creating a crack in the certainty he had been holding on to, and he adjusted his jacket subtly, smoothing the fabric across his chest as if restoring order to something visible might steady what was not, while Sophie's hands, now loosely clasped, tightened just enough to reveal the shift she was trying to contain. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment no longer belonged to words, it belonged to realization, to the slow, unavoidable shift that happens when assumption meets something it cannot easily dismiss, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, not claiming the space, not defending it, simply existing within it with a quiet assurance that did not need to be announced. And in that stillness, the room itself seemed to change, the lines of power and belonging redrawn not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable presence of truth waiting to be seen. The man in the dark suit finally took a small step closer to the table, not abrupt, not dramatic, but enough to draw a clear line between observation and action. And when he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that settled into the room like something inevitable, something that had been waiting for the right moment to arrive. "There is no confusion," he said, his tone even, measured, each word placed with precision. And he turned slightly toward Daniel and Sophie, his gaze steady but not unkind. This seat was assigned exactly as intended, and the air seemed to tighten around that statement. Not loud, not explosive, just final. Daniel blinked once, the reaction subtle but real, his expression holding for a fraction of a second before shifting, recalibrating, as if searching for a response that would restore the ground beneath him. But nothing came quickly enough, and Sophie's posture changed beside him, her shoulders drawing back just slightly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless. Her eyes now fixed on Ethan with a new awareness, one that replaced assumption with something closer to recognition. The man in the dark suit continued, his attention moving briefly to Ethan, then back again. "Mr. Cole confirmed his attendance personally," he added, and the use of the name, spoken clearly, without hesitation, seemed to echo louder than it should have, rippling outward through the quiet circle of attention that had formed around them. A faint murmur moved through the nearby tables, not loud enough to disrupt, but present enough to signal that the shift had begun, that the room was starting to understand what had been missed. Daniel's hand moved slightly at his side, fingers tightening then releasing, a controlled motion that could not fully hide the tension now visible in the set of his jaw. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more careful. "I was not aware," he said, the words measured, chosen, but lacking the certainty they carried before, while Sophie remained silent, her gaze dropping briefly to the name card, now perfectly aligned, as if seeing it for the first time without interpretation. Ethan did not react outwardly, his posture unchanged, his hands still resting lightly against the table, but there was a quiet shift in the space around him, not because he had asserted anything, but because the truth had been spoken in a way that no longer left room for doubt. And in that clarity, the balance of the moment tipped, not dramatically, but undeniably. The man in the dark suit gave a slight nod, as if confirming something already settled, and then, with a small gesture of his hand toward the chair, he added, "This is his seat." And the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not argue, it did not justify, it simply stated what was, and in doing so, it left everything else exposed. Daniel's gaze shifted to Ethan then, really looking at him now, not past him, not through him, but at him, and whatever he saw there did not match the assumptions he had walked in with. And that realization, quiet as it was, settled into his expression, softening the edges of his confidence into something more uncertain. Sophie's lips parted slightly as if to speak, then closed again, her earlier certainty replaced by a stillness that felt closer to reflection than reaction. And around them, the room exhaled in a way that was almost imperceptible, a collective adjustment as perception caught up to reality. Ethan remained exactly where he was, composed, grounded, his presence unchanged by the shift that had just taken place, as though the moment unfolding now was not a victory, not a correction, but simply the truth arriving at its own pace. And in that quiet arrival, everything that had been assumed only minutes before began to dissolve, leaving behind something clearer, something undeniable, something that no longer needed to be proven. Daniel's shoulders lowered just slightly, the shift almost imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. But it was there, the quiet release of something that had been held too tightly. And when he spoke this time, his voice no longer carried the same effortless certainty. Instead it moved carefully, measured, as if each word needed to pass through a filter before being allowed into the air. "Mr. Cole," he began. the name coming out slower than expected, as though it required adjustment. "I apologize," and the word lingered, unfamiliar in his tone, not dramatic, not overly emotional, but real enough to be felt. And beside him, Sophie drew in a small breath, her posture softening in a way that no longer tried to control the moment, but instead responded to it, her gaze meeting Ethan's directly now without the earlier distance. "We misunderstood," she added quietly, her voice steady but stripped of the earlier polish that had masked assumption as politeness. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression calm, not cold, not distant, simply present, and there was no immediate response from him, no quick acceptance or dismissal, just a moment of stillness where their words settled into the space between them, and that pause, that absence of urgency, seemed to hold more weight than any immediate reply could have, because it made the apology real, not transactional, not something that could be rushed through and moved past. The man in the dark suit remained just to the side, his role no longer active but still present, observing without interference, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. And around the table, the quiet attention from nearby guests did not disappear. It shifted, becoming something softer, less about curiosity and more about witnessing something that rarely happens so openly in spaces like this. Daniel cleared his throat lightly, his hand moving to adjust the cuff of his sleeve, a small gesture that seemed less about appearance now and more about grounding himself. "We should not have assumed," he continued, his voice lower, more honest in its restraint. And Sophie nodded faintly, her fingers unclasping as she let her hands rest naturally at her sides, no longer holding onto the tension she had tried to contain. Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a slight shift of his shoulders as he straightened in his chair, his hands lifting briefly from the table before resting again. And when he spoke, his voice remained even, calm, carrying no trace of resentment. "It happens," he said simply, the words quiet but clear, and in their simplicity, they carried something more than forgiveness, something that did not excuse the moment, but also did not hold on to it. Daniel's gaze lowered for a brief second before returning to Ethan, a subtle acknowledgement of the weight of that response, and Sophie's expression softened further, the tension in her features easing into something closer to reflection, as if the moment had reached deeper than the surface interaction itself. The room around them seemed to exhale again, the invisible pressure easing just enough to allow the ambient sounds to return more fully, the soft music, the quiet conversations, the gentle movement of servers weaving between tables. And yet the shift remained, something unspoken but understood, a recalibration of perception that would not simply fade away. Ethan reached for his glass once more, lifting it slightly before setting it back down in its place, the motion smooth, unhurried, as if re-establishing a rhythm that had never truly been broken. And as he settled back into stillness, the moment closed not with a declaration, not with a final word, but with a quiet understanding that had taken shape in the space between them, leaving behind something clearer than what had been there before. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices. It settled into something quieter, something that lingered in the air long after the words had been spoken, and Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as though nothing about him had needed to shift for the truth to arrive, because it had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Daniel stepped back slightly, creating a small but noticeable distance between himself and the chair, his hand brushing once along the edge of the table before falling to his side, a gesture that carried no authority now, only awareness, and Sophie followed that movement, her gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting. Again, softer this time, more measured, as if she were seeing the room through a different lens, one that no longer filtered people through expectation. The man in the dark suit gave a final, almost imperceptible nod, then turned away, his role complete, his steps quiet as he moved back into the flow of the evening, leaving behind a space that no longer felt uncertain but settled, defined, around the table. Conversations resumed, not abruptly, not as though nothing had happened, but carefully. Respectfully, the tone altered in a way that could not be undone, and a few nearby guests allowed themselves a glance toward Ethan, not with curiosity now, but with recognition, The kind that comes after understanding has replaced assumption. Ethan reached forward and adjusted the fork beside his plate, aligning it with the knife in a small, precise motion, then smoothed the edge of the linen where the faint crease remained, his movements calm, deliberate, restoring order not because it had been lost, but because he chose to maintain it. And in that quiet act, there was something grounding, something that spoke louder than any explanation. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, as if unsure whether to leave or stay, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that felt closer to reflection. And when he finally pulled out the chair beside Sophie, the sound was softer than before, the motion more careful, as though he were aware now of the space he occupied, aware of how easily it could be misunderstood. Sophie sat slowly, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze drifting once more to Ethan before settling forward, not avoiding, not staring, simply present, and the distance between them, though unchanged physically, no longer carried the same meaning it had minutes before. The soft glow of the city skyline beyond the glass cast reflections across the table, light shifting gently over polished surfaces, over glass, over silver, over the small card that still bore Ethan's name, clear and centered, exactly where it belonged, and the faint sound of a server placing a dish down at a nearby table blended into the background, part of a rhythm that had resumed but not forgotten. Ethan lifted his glass again, this time bringing it to his lips, taking a slow, measured sip, the motion unhurried, and when he set it back down, the quiet tap against the table echoed just enough to be heard in the space closest to him, a small, final note that seemed to close the moment without needing to announce it. No one spoke about what had happened, not directly, but it remained there, in the way Daniel kept his voice lower when he spoke next, in the way Sophie listened more than she had before, in the way the people around them carried themselves with a subtle shift in awareness, and Ethan, still composed, still grounded, remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, not elevated by the moment, not changed by it, simply seen. And in that quiet recognition, the evening moved forward, leaving behind not a scene, but a silence that held the weight of something understood at last.